spend some time with you today. I've been looking at the topic of strategy and innovation, what works, what doesn't work, and some of the frontiers of it. Obviously, you worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of companies, and you've led some pioneering, innovative work yourself, and great credit to you. In your experience, what are the biggest areas that sort of companies get wrong? Is it the frameworks they use? Is it their mindset? Is it the enablement and culture? Obviously, it's all of them, but what are the ones you particularly pinpoint?
So I think there's still a couple of myths around innovation and treating innovation strategically, right? So there are a couple of big confusions, but I'll start maybe with a different angle. So the biggest challenge today is that a lot of business models are expiring. Take the pharmaceutical industry, right? They know their business model is dead. Other, banking, their business model is dying. Their value propositions are dying, but they're not giving the future a sufficiently powerful space. And what I mean with that is there is no company probably on the planet that doesn't do innovation, that doesn't have an incubator, but I would characterize 90% of that, at least 80%. I don't have the data, unfortunately, but we should probably do some research on that. I would qualify that as innovation theater. And that's a term that Steve Blank, Rita McGrath, and I use a lot. And that means, doing it for the gallery. So it's not a lack of activity. Every company is doing this stuff. Every company has an incubator. Everybody has something to point to. Everybody goes to Silicon Valley. But if you look at how many companies do this strategically, it kind of melts down to very few. And those are the companies we tried to portray in our latest book, The Invincible Company. So if you take Ping An, for example, to use an example that's not overused, everybody uses Amazon and so on, that's a good example. But Ping An is an outstanding example and role model, if you want, for incumbents. Amazon a little bit less, right? Because they started as a disruptor. But Ping An, I don't know if you know the story, but less than 10 years ago, the founder, Peter Ma, said, we're in the insurance and banking business. We're going to get killed by technology companies. We're going to get killed, right? So it was this obsession of going out of business. And what they did is they invested in innovation. But here's the thing. They didn't just invest in innovation. They gave innovation power. So he hired Jessica Tan with the mandate to become a technology company, to invent the future of Ping An, and doing that knowing they would fail a lot. But she became co-CEO, and that's the key thing here. Innovation had a very powerful space in the company. The co-CEO was responsible for that at the same level as the CEO. Okay, so that is a very strong symbolic. And why Ping An? Why is Ping An interesting? Because they were in banking and insurance, right? They weren't a technology company, but they became one. If you look at the results, they went from the top 400 companies in the world, the FT, top 500 list or however that's called, they went to the top 30 companies. And profit growth is insane, right? So there are results to show. So the last time, before COVID, I had a meeting with one of the biggest financial institutions in Europe with a CEO. And he was asking, how long does this take? And I said, well, depends on your commitment. Look at Ping An. They committed, and it took them less than 10 years to do it. So it's not the activity itself that is enough. It's not the money itself. It's the giving innovation power. So either the CEO needs to do it. That's one possibility. Or you need to create an equally powerful position. So it's either an entrepreneurial CEO. So if you take Logitech, it's a guy called Bracken Darrell, who is an entrepreneurial CEO. He wasn't an entrepreneur. He came from Procter & Gamble, but he's an entrepreneurial CEO. So I think the biggest mistake in strategy and innovation today, and I'm increasingly using these as synonyms, is the lack of power that innovation has. And now the second piece, and sorry, I'm babbling because I'm excited about this stuff.
No, please carry on.
The second piece is strategy is two things today. It's managing your portfolio of existing businesses
Yes.
And it's managing your portfolio of future businesses, which are basically the beginning ideas that you're de-risking. So you're actually managing two portfolios. And if you look at many companies, innovation activities are completely disconnected from strategy. If you look at Ping An, that was not the case, right? So there is a clear improvement of the existing business models. They use technology in the insurance business to improve that. But at the same time, they invented new business models. So for example, a banking platform to serve other financial institutions. So strategy is improving the existing and inventing the future. That sounds trivial, but if you look at companies today and think Roger Martin's framing of strategy, most companies don't even really, and here I'm quoting Roger Martin, most companies don't do strategy. Most of their statements that they call strategic are actually just, kind of working, a couple of bullet points working on the present. So he likes to say, when the contrary is stupid, it's not strategy. For example, we want to have world-class quality. That's not a strategy because no company wants, world-class bad quality, right?
Or they may put a wrapper of a big lofty purpose statement, which gives them a sheen of strategy. Purpose statements can work, right, as long as they're obviously strategic and they go through the organization. But they put that on top, focus on the managerial parts of the business, have an innovation hub or team around the edge, and then wrap it around and call it a strategy. I can't because they're confidential, and I still want to work with some of these. I could give you quite a few companies in that bracket. Can I just go back? Can I go back to your point about the giving it power and your examples? Because you do advocate, obviously, in your latest book, a sort of a chief entrepreneur, and whether it's and I guess you've said there it could be a CEO but has that entrepreneurial acumen and spirit. How often do you see or do you envisage having, if you like, dual roles? Because that's quite rare. I mean, I see a CEO and I see powerful people around him or her, but having somebody at the same level focusing on the future as opposed to the current is relatively rare in my purview. But I'd be interested to get your sense of what you see and envisage.
Yeah. So again, the shape it takes doesn't really matter as long as innovation has power at the very top, right? So in some cases, take Jeff Bezos, it is the CEO. Take Logitech, it is the CEO, Bracken Darrell. If you take Ping An, it's not the CEO, it's not the chairman, it's not Peter Ma. He gave the power to somebody else. Yeah. So what is important is that innovation is present at the very top. And here's the important thing, I think people kind of get confused when we talk about innovation. So let me just make a side remark. Innovation as a word without something in front of it means nothing. Because there are different types of innovation. There's efficiency innovation, there's sustaining innovation, there's transformative innovation, right? That builds on Clay Christensen's stuff, right? But we need to differentiate because everybody can do, so sometimes people say everybody needs to be an innovator. Bullshit. Like, yes, everybody needs to think about efficiency innovation. Not everybody needs to build the future business, right? So we need to kind of distinguish. And then we start to understand, if we look at our portfolio, so here's one thing we do with companies very often, is we get them to write down, so I'll give you one example, I can't mention the name, but I was in Thailand with one of the biggest companies in Southeast Asia, and I had the board and the top leadership in a room, and I asked them to write down the 5 innovations that they're most proud of the last 5 years. Write it down on a sticky note. And then I got them to classify it, put it up on a window in these 3 buckets: efficiency innovation, sustaining innovation, transformative innovation. Meaning transformative innovation means I'm building the business models for tomorrow. So it's my next 20 to 50 years of the company. Sustaining innovation is maintaining the existing business model, right? So they put up their sticky notes, 90% in efficiency innovation. Then you have, 8% in sustaining and 2% in transformative. And then I asked 2, 3 questions. We take transformative away because that's an idea. It's not a reality. So we just take it, throw it away in the garbage. And what it does is it shows these companies that yes, they're doing innovation, but it's improving the existing. And now don't get me wrong, that's good. That's not wrong. But when your business model is dying, and it will, that's not enough. So basically, they're creating innovations that will help them more efficiently die to a certain extent, right? A good example of that, to make it very concrete, was Kodak with the digital camera.
Sure.
People bought a lot of their digital cameras, but that was not, it was actually killed. It was almost like innovation suicide. It killed their existing business model, right? So you need to do all three types of innovation. The only reason not to do transformative innovation is when your business model is so strong that you don't need to innovate for a long period of time. That was the case with Microsoft. They never invested in transformative innovation. Steve Ballmer milked the cow, and that worked really well, but then they fell off a cliff.
Yeah.
So you can't survive anymore without doing transformative innovation in the long term. You used to be able to do that, right? There's all the business process reengineering and so on. So first, just to explain, people don't yet, I think leaders don't always understand. They say, but we're investing in blockchain and all that. Fine. But if you're just improving your existing business models, that's not enough for the next 20 to 50 years.
Yeah, there's a slight innovation laziness, right? I don't
think it's laziness.
No?
I don't think it's laziness. No,
Okay.
They're not aware. Because look,
it's awareness. Okay.
Look what's happening. I have one global airline in mind. We did this kind of assessment workshop, and they're winning prizes for their innovation, right? They're getting industry awards for innovating. Why? Because everybody thinks innovation is technology innovation. They don't realize, okay, that's fine, but if I'm improving my business model, that's not wrong. But when the business model is dying, and sorry, it was disrupted right now by COVID, you need to invest in something else. So it's not laziness, it's a lack of understanding. And the first CEOs now that I meet are starting to acknowledge this. So they say, innovation, for us was a black box for a very long time. It was much easier to invest in mergers and acquisitions. One CEO I have in mind of this financial institution saying, Alex, I understand now we need to invest in portfolios. He did not understand the concept of managing a portfolio in the broader sense, right? They understand managing a portfolio of existing business units for sure, but he did not understand this idea of a portfolio of opportunities where you make many, many small bets and you follow up on it like a venture capitalist. So there is really still a big lack of understanding. And it's not to say these people are stupid. They didn't grow up in the world of innovation. They grew up, if you want, in the world of management. And that's what they were paid to do.
And
but the world has changed.
They got promoted on that basis. So no, you're right. And I clearly overestimated the level of awareness in that. I just want to talk about scaling as a concept and a practice, because you talked about your days with the board, workshops. I've done some of that myself. I've been party to it, and they work to a degree. And obviously the question then is, even with the power that you talked about earlier, how you actually, I guess, build the capability at all levels of, the relevant levels across the organization, and you sustain it. So it's not, and I caricature just for effect, a sort of a spike where you have a great, typically in summer, when you can, you have the away days, you have a nice innovation day, hackathons, etc., and you may plan a number of them, but in between, right? And I'm sorry, take a deep breath as I say it, heretical to you. In between, there's the innovation theatre at the day-to-day level, but the reality is they are managing, even if it's innovation, efficiency innovation, they're still not innovating day-to-day. And so there's a sort of spike. And if you looked over a period of time, 6, 12, 18 months, actually not much has changed. And I guess my question is, from what you've seen and experienced and obviously advised on, what are the most important ingredients for scaling innovation, if you like, interventions?
So, when I talk about innovation theater, that sounds very arrogant and kind of downplaying the efforts of these companies. That's not the intention, right? So I do see many teams, heads of innovation, they're actually relatively powerless. They're at the maximum at the VP level, maybe at the director level. They're doing good work sometimes. So you can have a world-class accelerator, but it's not transforming the company, right? So there's some cases I have in mind, won't mention names, where the doers level, the accelerators, is disconnected from the leadership level. So my again, it's not I don't have the data to prove this, but on an anecdotal basis, it's really across the board of the companies we see. The work that's being done is not always bad. There's actually, we call it innovation theater, not because it's bad work, but because it's disconnected and it's not integrated into the strategy. So it's toothless, right? It's like a toothless monster. So what's lacking is actually the top down. So for innovation to work, we now know, based on all of the mistakes we've done and all of the things that we've seen not going right, we know it's a bottom up and a top down movement. Okay. Bottom up are the activities, the processes, the tools. We've been historically very strong in that field with the business model canvas, value proposition canvas. We integrated lean startup movement, made that clear, right? But what was lacking in all of these efforts with teams doing really good work is the top-down enablement framework. And what I mean with that is leaders in senior leaders, the C-level and the board. I think the board has a role to play, and they're not playing it. The C-level needs to create the conditions for innovators to thrive. Otherwise, you can't scale. So the accelerators need to be integrated into the strategy, which means you need to have a clear role for them to invent the future. That's rarely the case. People don't see accelerators as that is our future. That needs to be explicit. At Ping An, the whole effort was seen as the future of the company. But here's the challenge that you have as a leader is you need to make sure that this remains a partnership, because the innovators sometimes think, oh, those old farts over there. And then the old farts think, oh, those innovators, they're getting special treatment. No, here's what the leadership needs to make sure is that it creates a partnership between those who are managing the present, which is incredibly important. At GE, why did things fall apart? Because they did actually not manage the present well enough. They invested pretty well in the future. So it needs to be a partnership where they're equals, because the innovators will actually need access to the executors, to the managers. Sometimes you need access to the supply chain, you need access to customers. And at one point, the ideas coming out of the exploration engine, right, need to make it to the execution engine, because entrepreneurs are not very good at scaling and managing, right? After maybe 10 million in revenues, it should go to the executor. So there's this whole kind of dance. And I think that if I see one thing not working today, it's creating the conditions for success. And creating the conditions for success is having a clear exploit and explore portfolio and a clear partnership between those two worlds. They need to be separate, but they need to be integrated. If they're too separate, they're dead. If they're too integrated, they're dead, right? So do you see the dichotomy here? It's actually a very challenging kind of balance. You need to separate them, because otherwise a new business model will get killed by the execution engine. But you need to integrate them, because otherwise they won't have access to what they need, from the execution engine. So silly example, if you're just, what do companies have that startups don't have? Customers, brand, resources, patents, all that kind of stuff. If you are just an accelerator with no access, you're basically a startup in chains, or you're working in startups in chains, right? So you're worse off than a startup. If you start to have access to all of the resources, that's when large companies can really use their advantage. So I believe that today, startups are better funded and they have better incentives to grow new competitive disruptive business models, because the large companies are not investing strategically in innovation yet. Once they start to do that, once they create the organizational structures, once the leaders really create those conditions for success, those innovation garages, which are today mainly innovation theater, will become value creation machines like we've never seen before. And look at Amazon. I mean, there are a lot of things we can criticize, but they're damn good at innovation. Look at Ping An. They're damn good at innovation. These become innovation machines that are unstoppable. So that's what we call invincible company. They're invincible not because they have a monopoly position. They become invincible because they're obsessed by dying. Steve,
They keep going. They keep going. They keep reinventing. Keep going in different
Jobs
ways.
had that. Jeff Bezos is obsessed by dying. You know, Peter Ma at Ping An said, "We're going to die. If we don't become a technology company, we're going to die." So it's this obsession of getting killed that makes you invincible. The moment you lean back, then that's the moment it's over. And that's why the headquarters, that it's called day one, the headquarters of Amazon, right? Day one. Why? Because they want to keep that humble attitude of we can die if we don't continue to innovate.
Yeah, indeed. Those are very powerful, very powerful. I spoke with Jeremy Darroch recently, the CEO of Sky, now part of Comcast, and he talked about constant renewal as a mindset and a culture. He spent most of the discussion actually talking about cultural aspects, enablement aspects. Whereas if you thought Sky 5-10 years before, that wouldn't have been the case. And secondly, he's thinking about what do they need to leave behind to create the space, the capital, in order to invest for the future. And again, that's the sort of topic, the legacy aspects, you know, mindsets, processes, systems often get shunted behind. I just wanted to delve down into, if you like, the communication of strategy and innovation. If I loosely lump them together, obviously you've pioneered, you know, fantastic work that, if you like, helps to clarify concepts, access an audience of people who now are learning to. You may say the awareness is less, but learning to use these concepts and frameworks at scale. Where do you see the next frontier for, you know, your work and, if you like, your movement? Because you've come a long way. There's a lot of companies who are not using it still, and that's a great commercial opportunity for you. But where do you see the next frontier for your work? And I'm not trying to steal business secrets, but I'm interested in the sort of the next wave.
No, I'm happy to share ideas, right? Because the hard part is not to actually take the ideas, to turn it into something real.
Sure.
So we started out with the concept of business models, right? Then we added the value proposition canvas. Then we added the whole, you know, we used the lean startup work by Steve Blank and Eric Ries. Then with this last book, we realized it's actually the top level. So we created the portfolio map. That was the key thing is, you know, to just illustrate our thinking. We sat down with my co-author Yves Pigneur and said, we created a language, a shared language for doers, business models and value propositions. Now, if we move to the next level, the CEO of Nestle, the CEO of GE, they don't actually care about business models per se. They care about resource allocation to their portfolio of business models, okay? So our question was, can we create a shared language for the senior leadership level, like we created a shared language at the doers level? So that's how we came up with the portfolio map. And we started to have these two other tools, right? One is what we call corporate identity. So we use this, you know, triangle concept and the culture map. So those are three tools at that level, okay? And culture, what you just mentioned, is key. And that, when I say creating the conditions for innovators to thrive, that has to do with creating that innovation culture. For the Explore portfolio, the Exploit portfolio needs to keep a hardcore execution culture. I just listened to I'm listening to a book of the former CEO of Honeywell when they went through this transition from a really bad company to really a powerful one. And he talks about that constant restructuring. So it's actually not bad to do that constant restructuring of your execution engine. It's just that approach is not enough anymore. You need to also invent, right? But so now the frontier is this. I think we really, with this book, I believe, from the work we're seeing in the companies we're doing, we're taking this ambidextrous concept that everybody's been talking about for a long time. That's not new, but we're adding the tools to actually put this in place, right?
Yes.
So typically, you know, we do some innovation assessment so companies know where they're standing, and then we help them put this in place. The piece that we haven't really addressed in our work, because we only write new books when we feel like there's a need in the market. So when we see somebody else does it, you know, as a better concept, well, no need to do it, right? Blue Ocean Strategy was great. We didn't need to reinvent Steve Blank's or Eric Ries's work.
You're practicing what you preach in terms of being savvy, right?
Try to, yeah. But there's one big piece that is missing, and that I think is the next frontier. And I think Gary Hamel has started to scratch on the surface of that, which is the organizational structures. So we still have, hierarchies and matrix organizations that are relatively rigid and not very agile. And then there's this word agile, and everybody, it became this buzzword. But I do think, so again, I think there's always an opportunity when a word spreads. So organizational agility is this buzzword now, or agility in general, but there's no shared understanding around organizational agility. So new shapes of new organizational forms to be extremely dynamic, I would say that's the next frontier. In the sense of, I'll try to make it concrete because this is like intellectual blah, blah, right? Today, we have institutionalized budgets. So at the beginning of the year, you have to present your strategic budgeting, you get a budget, and then you have that throughout the year. There's zero flexibility, and often is actually based on the results of last year. There is no flexibility, there's some concepts where it's zero cost, or how's it called? Zero cost budgeting, I don't remember, where you start over. But there is no today. I think, we should be inspired more by cell organisms that constantly adapt, right? Some pieces die, some pieces, grow, but this whole idea of emerging and dying all the time. And what I mean with that is very simple. So every company will have value propositions and business models that will emerge, that will become successful, and they'll die. Sometimes you can reinvent them, sometimes you can't, and they should die, and everything with it. The challenge is that the organization is flexible enough to take the people from that dying entity and recycle them. So it doesn't become, oh, we need to fire everybody in that unit. No, you need to be more agile. And to a certain extent, W.L. Gore already has that internal job market kind of thing where resources constantly get reallocated. And the reason I think this is important, sorry I get passionate about this, is actually there's a moral obligation here. Is people say, yeah, but companies should die. Well, that's very easy when you're sitting in your comfortable chair, somewhere in Switzerland, and it's hypothetical. People losing jobs is a terrible thing. It's not just a terrible thing for them. It actually costs the state a ton of money. So if we could help companies innovate better, become more flexible, we'll have a new type of job security. Not one that is entitlement, but one that is based on dynamic renewal. So what motivates me to work on innovation is not to help a company make more millions or billions. Frankly, people are wealthy enough. It's more about creating more value and more job security, value for customers, value for the team, value for society, and ultimately that ideal, where people can work on what they enjoy and have some stability around their job security, back to job security, but not the way we've had it,
Well, people are learning, upskilling, reskilling, and yes, I have to say it's refreshing to hear that. And I like that concept of dynamic renewal. I spoke with Gary recently, and we talked quite a lot about that. The resource allocation issue. So you can have all the, as you just, I won't repeat it as you talked about, but also actually, if you like, finding the right organizational model or models at different stages of the evolution of an organization. We tend to hear, and I spend a lot of time on this, trying to marry strategy, innovation, leadership, and the organizational model. We tend to hear of things like autonomous organizations, distributed responsibility, hire being the example that everybody's focusing on at the moment. But then you look at the reality of it. Yes, there's autonomy at particular levels to make decisions, but there's a lot of bounds around them. There's a clear direction set. And so my point being that actually we tend to bound, there's a lot of blah, blah, blah about an organizational model being the norm, but actually you look under the skin of the organization, there's probably lots of hybrids and lots of different stages. And I think the skill of, if you like, the leader is obviously selecting the right one in the right context, depending on the types of, the pursuit you're going for, but also moving people around for the reasons you set out, but actually not being dogmatic. I see a lot of people sometimes being, I'm not trying to be negative, I'm a very positive person, but I see people being sort of, oh, our organizational model has to be about, it's all about inclusive leadership, and that means X, Y, and Z. Of course, that's foundational values, but actually different business units may need different styles, different approaches, and it's how you create the organizational portfolio if you like, that actually differentiates the winners from the organizations that perhaps struggle. That's my observation.
Can I build on something you said? Actually, I think that the challenge for leaders today is, many leaders come from a management background, managing the existing, and they're relatively good at that, and that is okay. The problem is that inventing the future is very different. So when you manage an organization, and the business model doesn't really change, experience matters, and you can actually pick the winners. Okay, so if you've launched 5 products and you're just working on, version 6, your past experience probably says something about the future. Here's the challenge for leaders. When you're inventing the future, they need to act differently. It's not up to them to pick the winning ideas. So here's where they can learn from venture capitalists. Venture capitalists invest in a portfolio. Why? Because they know they can't pick the sole winner, but they do believe that they can make 10 picks, of which one, and it's actually the data is astonishingly, that the winner is worth more than all of, we take the 9 other investments, right? So, but they know they can't pick that one winner, so they pick 10. So what you need to do as a leader in the entrepreneurial space where you invent the future is create the ability to invest in 10. Actually, the data shows it's 250 ideas to create one outlier at the very early stage. So you need to invest in many, many ideas because you can't pick the winner. And that's where some of the Jeff Bezos quotes are very powerful, where he says, one winner will pay for thousands of failures. He literally uses thousands of failures. And he means that because he knows exactly how many failures they had. And that's why, so people, some kind of, they say this lightly, oh, we need to cherish failure. Kind of stupid to a certain extent. And then the others say, no, it's not about failure, it's about learning. It's not about failure, it's not about learning. It's actually about investing in all of those so the winners can emerge. You don't pick the winners, the winners emerge. What you do is you constantly invest in those that show most tractions, and the outlier will emerge. And the only thing you can do as a leader is create the conditions for success. You don't pick the winners. And now back to your initial thing, and I think that's what's important with this whole autonomous. You need to create very clear guidelines, what's in and what's out. We call that portfolio guidelines. So if you take Ping An, it was very clear. They said, we need to become a technology companies, and they would invest in 5 arenas. That was the innovation guideline. Other than that, people were free to act. So they were autonomous, but within guardrails. And that's what's missing. So leaders need to create 2 things: the conditions for success and the portfolio guidance, so people know what's in and what's out. Same thing at Amazon. They have very clear portfolio guidance. Same thing at Logitech, very clear portfolio guidance with the conditions for success. And that is very different from old style management.
I agree. And I think the trick in each of the companies we may look at is that the portfolio guidance is how specific that needs to be, because there are companies that everyone talks about as being highly innovative, where there's a lot of freedom. The reality, the guardrails and the guidelines, sometimes for good reason, are very specific in terms of who can make which decisions, how much capital they can put, and so and obviously that needs to be revisited depending on how the business evolves. But it's not a case of just, okay, come back in a year's time. Here's your rate of return. Come back and please deliver. And that's sometimes what I think can be missing. So I agree with your premise of that sort of organizational design is a next component. I think there's another one potentially, which you clearly already discussed to a large degree, but it's around how, if you like, foresight can infuse the future, if you like, the future business models in a more structured way. And I've spent a lot of time in that in various roles, moving it from being probably a bit like the innovation theatre, the sort of the interesting work into as opposed to it being a mindset and a capability to help think through, trends, developments, genuine disruptions of different types, and then work out the trade-offs, the choices that come from it. The very quick example I give is, it's interesting when you go and speak with venture capital or private equity in particular, and they talk about foresight. That's a good test, because frankly, they're not really interested in trends and all the other stuff. It's right. How do you create the portfolio where you can have the one, as you said, the one thing that pays off? But I think as a capability of how you do it, how you actually develop foresight. Amy Webb clearly is doing a lot of work in this space at the moment, and how you integrate it with, the strategic capability and innovation, and then the organizational. That I think needs to be sort of seen, brought together in a more structured way. That would be my take.
So 2 things I would add to the conversation. One related to foresight. So I think foresight is great, and some companies actually do a pretty good job. What sometimes is missing, it becomes analysis paralysis, right? So we do a lot of studying of what could be foresight and trends and so. At the end of the day, and that's where the whole kind of lean startup movement made a big contribution, you need to experiment with this stuff, right? Because otherwise you're never going to learn what's going to fly, because it becomes kind of a hypothesis about the future. And then some people, say, well, we're a big company, we're going to acquire anyways. I say, well, look, it's very simple. Yes, sometimes you need to decide if you're going to make an acquisition or if you're going to grow it yourself, but you'll make better acquisitions if you've learned from customers, if you've done things yourself. You make really bad acquisitions when you don't have the experience in that space. So you need to use the full instrument. So we call this portfolio actions, right? So yes, foresight is great. Again, though, foresight without that portfolio of experimentation is very dangerous.
It has to be very dangerous and frankly a waste of time, and can be frustrating, because you sort of open the eyes to people and then basically nothing happens. I'm curious about your...
One thing I think that, sometimes we take it for granted, we did, and we realize it's not the case. So with Strategyzer, we've been into visual tools now for 2 decades, right? And we always kind of took it for granted. It's visual, it's clear. What I started to realize even more now at the senior leadership level, the ability to create clarity, transparency around your portfolio of existing businesses and future businesses in terms of which ones have been tested, how much have you decreased the risk, how much is the potential. This shared language is incredibly powerful. So because the world is becoming more complex, because you need to make decisions faster, because it's more about enablement than picking, you need to you need to shift towards an insane amount of transparency to make actually evidence-based investments. And without transparency, that's not going to happen. It's still going to be some executive with the fatter business card picking the best ideas that he or she likes. That's not going to work. But as soon as you create transparency and you can say, this idea here, we actually tested it, we decreased the risk by 60%. So we decreased the risk of investing in something stupid by 60%. Here, you're showing me $1 billion idea, but it's nothing else than an idea. Now you can compare, right? So I think we're underestimating, against on the high level, typically we're not doing anything new on the highest level. Of course, everybody's been talking about ambidextrous, but this is becoming a profession where, ideology and big principles is just not enough anymore. Imagine if accountants work based on lofty principles. So innovation is moving away from principles, lean startup principles, come on, towards actually innovation accounting, really hardcore stuff that you can learn and that you have to learn. I mean, imagine your medical doctor showed up and said, oh, I did a workshop over the weekend, I'm going to snip it around on you, I got this new procedure. No way, right? Innovation is at that stage where we're moving towards, we're learning the physiology, and we've done enough kind of internships so we know what we're talking about. So it's becoming a lot more professional, as professional maybe as some parts of management. Definitely closer also to finance.
That's really interesting. I love your vivid language. I've sat in many and participated in many executive committees over the last couple of decades and boards. And it is, firstly, I second your point on the fact that when there is a shared language and a mindset and set of capabilities, where in simple terms, there's less talk about information and the politicking, and you still need a degree of that, but more around genuine choices, genuine trade-offs, and people are sharing it. One, it's quicker sometimes. Secondly, just you can cut through the crap, the blah blah blah, whatever words you use, and get to the point a lot quicker. But some of the most impressive organizations are the ones that keep refreshing that capability, as opposed to it being, right, this is the way we do it, it's locked in now for the next 2 years. And secondly, you also need new voices, fresh faces, different backgrounds coming in for all the reasons we know. And in some ways, and having a dashboard, mission control, whatever term you want, as you would in finance, going back to your accounting, in finance, with SAP powered, you'd have the map in front of you, and having been, it's not an area I look at, but I've worked on a number of programs that have a big finance element. It's a sort of norm. You wouldn't sit in a steering committee or an executive committee without that. Well, I guess what you have been doing, and doing very successfully, is creating that, the framework, the tools, the transparency, so it moves from being a big fat PowerPoint document that you ship out and then you leave, to being embedded in the organization. The one specific question, I'm very conscious of our time, and I'm being greedy, but allow me just for a minute or two more. Where do you talked about where you go next. How embedded would you get in your business? Obviously, you provide fantastic books, training sessions, and if a CEO came to you and says, "Look, Alex, your team's fantastic. Yes, you're teaching us, you're inspiring us, and so on, but we want you to get hands rolled up." Would you go into the space of those dreaded management consultants in your own particular way, or would you say, actually, we are the software business, we're the SAP of the strategy world? And I mean that as a compliment, by the way. I'm not comparing you, but you're that type of business. Would you delve into that space of execution?
So that's exactly what we're doing now. The challenge is, people don't work this way yet in strategy. So you first have to get them to work like this. So there's not even a real market yet for software, if you want, right? There's PowerPoint, there's data analytics, and so, but visualizing strategy and so on, not so much. But it's starting, and the way we call it is technology-enabled services. So we productize growth portfolio services, right? So we help companies today. Some cases are public, right? So we work with Bayer to build their growth portfolio. This is a standard problem across every single organization. You have things that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? It is a very standard problem. And then in every industry, you'll have different tweaks, in every organization have different tweaks. But some of it can be standardized, and some of it can, the support of software can help you visualize certain decisions. So your portfolio, you should be able to visualize it. Making evidence-based investments in the different ideas should be automated, and supported. So it's not about taking away the human creativity of innovation. It's about providing the tools to leverage. And the best image I found is computer-aided design and architecture. So computer-aided design doesn't replace, take Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is one example of an architect that used computer-aided design a lot. Many of the buildings he made couldn't have been done without computer-aided design. Does that take away the creativity? No, but it brings it to the next level. That's where today innovation services would benefit from good software. And that's what we're doing. That's our ambition, to work towards, the SAP of strategy and innovation. And we're seeing the first fruits of that. Actually, COVID-19, with all the negative side effects in terms of health and economy, for Strategyzer, it's been a very positive thing, because all of our work remote. So we work with companies on our platform. We support them with the software. So all of it is already done remotely. So the only thing we had to do is take the physical workshops at the beginning of an innovation sprint and start to do it remotely. And we do that on our platform. And that was the only little step that was required. So we have companies now that are scaling up their innovation efforts with us, because we provide this kind of technology-enabled services. Fantastic. And again, that doesn't replace human creativity, the human mind. It leverages, right? And
you're not going to step into you're clear. Well, you're clear, right? You have clarity on your positioning, where you're playing. You're not going to step into the area and the space for either in-house teams doing it themselves. You're an enablement type role. Where do you see? There's two questions I have. Then I'll leave you. One is, where do you see management consultants playing, given the trends you just talked about? And the second related question, going back to the space for human creativity and judgment, is what type of role do you think AI in particular could play in the capabilities we've talked about? It plays in customer service, HR, R&D, and so on, and spotting trends, developing and looking at relationships. As far as I see, it doesn't play a role, and I don't mean creating an AI-based organization, but in the innovation process or the strategy process, I don't see many examples of companies using it as a sort of as a tool. I say that, and now you're going to give me a list of 10, 20, 30 companies. David, you just don't know. But two questions really. One is where you see management consultants playing, and secondly, the role of AI.
So I think management consulting is transforming pretty radically. Couple of things. First thing is management, and there's a whole, like, there are very different domains of management consulting, right? You can be in the cost cutting, you can be in innovation. So it depends a little bit what you're talking about. But the traditional approach of management consulting is throwing, and I'm being very black and white, right? Throwing people at a problem and helping solve it as if it was a new problem again and again and again. And you kind of still reuse decks. And so rather than seeing it as, are there problems in management consulting that are exactly the same from a structural point of view, not from the answer point of view, okay, the recommendation or so, but from a structural point of view. So today we can clearly see all the companies we deal with, they have an explore challenge to put the structures in place. Yeah. They all need to create innovation portfolios. That's the same challenge. Now, the answer to which business models, et cetera, that's unique to every company. So the consultants are becoming more and more facilitators, not people who, consult in the terms of giving advice. We give advice on process, and we help them give birth to the right answers, but we don't give them the right answers. So it's this shift towards more coaching, and it's the shift towards a certain standardization for some types of problems, right? Yeah. And then there are others, they're always unique. But I think that's a big shift that I would see. The other one I'd see is really the use of technology-enabled services. So in some cases, technology can actually leverage what we're doing, and they just need to figure out what. And to a certain extent, a lot of these professional service firms are trying to figure out how can they go into a product business. I think that the old thing is actually giving the management consultants or strategy consultants a bad rep, which is, let me get the contract and then I'll figure out how to actually solve the problem. They don't even have the skills yet. So in our case, we're being very boutique and saying, this is the type of problem we can help you with. Yes. Period. If you're outside of that, don't come to us. We have some recommendations for advisors that can help you make tailor-made, but there's a problem set that will be increasingly productized because it's the same problem over and over again. Do you see what I mean with that?
I do, yeah.
And that's a big shift, I think.
And management consultancies generally are not great product developers, to put it mildly. Yeah. I'm not talking about my old firm, just Jan, I know most of them. But it's an interesting flip in terms of your power and I'd be slightly cheeky saying this, in terms of your own firm and you being more of the orchestrator, if you like, and then, as you say, bringing in others, as opposed to it being, the big management consultancies bringing in a boutique to run an innovation day. That's an interesting flip, but that's for another day. AI then, the last there is AI. What's
AI is a technology, if you want, that you can use to innovate, right? That's clear. In some cases, say airline, you'll use AI for this and that to optimize this or that, right? That's not the piece I can talk about because I'm not an expert on AI. But what I do know is when it comes to innovation, so we can measure the reduction of risk and uncertainty of a team that is testing their ideas, okay? Now, here's the thing, if you have hundreds of teams, so normally a company should invest in hundreds of teams in order to let the winners emerge. And some are starting to work like that. You know, Bayer, public case, one of our clients, another client, Bosch, they're doing exactly that, okay? But here's what we don't have yet, but what we can do once we have a bigger data set is when you have the data of all of these innovation teams that are using the same methodology, you can start to figure out which ones are performing well and why. So all of a sudden you might see, oh, those teams that are first testing, you know, desirability of customer pains, which is, you know, they tend to go faster towards validation of this or that, right? Or, you know, you can even see those teams that invest in testing that first, they actually tend to, you know, go further in the phases. That is something that AI will help with, but you need a large data set. So it's just like today, you know, Tesla investing so much in autopilot. Actually, they're the only company today that has such a rich data set to start to use AI to produce, you know, new kinds of services which will come out in the future. Daimler does not have that. They don't have enough cars on the road to even have that data set. So AI only makes sense when you have a large data set, right? So I think that's going to happen in innovation inevitably once we start to have large data sets.
Yeah, and that happens already, obviously already in customer service, where what you just talked about applies and very well. It may be too granular for, you know, a different context, but again, it's the same principle of understanding what interventions work to what time, what type of efficacy. You've been very generous with your time and very thoughtful and very passionate and insightful. If we were having this conversation in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years time, wherever you decide to do something else, and I'm sure you have a whole portfolio of things yourself, you have your own portfolio map, what would you like to be known for in terms of what you've done? What would be your motto in terms of your own purpose and your own impact?
Having helped people make a difference. So, you know, enable people. I mean, what gets me excited is giving people tools that make a difference in their lives and in their work. As simple as that.